All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Project Offbeat podcast, the show where we bring in the most unconventional careers or the non-corporate careers out there. You know the drill. We bring in guests to talk about their careers, and we bring it to you for you to be able to appreciate this career, possibly a career that you've never heard about. Matt, first of all, happy Valentine's Day. We're shooting this
Happy Valentine's.
9 a.m., right? So this is really a very exciting thing na we're doing, no? Instead of going on a date, Matt, we're here recording an episode. How are you feeling this Hearts Day, bro?
Wala namang plano. So, I mean, ito na yung date ko basically. Ito, Project
Ayun.
Offbeat is my date for this Valentine's.
Awesome, awesome. Anyways, Matt, you know what? In today's episode, I cannot emphasize that this may probably be our hardest episode yet.
Yeah.
Okay. And hardest, yeah, not because of anything, no, but because I think that this career really requires a lot of research and a lot of thinking and a lot of critical questions for us to be able to bring out the best content for this career. 'Di ba? Pero yun nga, Matt, no, sabi nga ni Father Ferios, 'di ba? Huwag tanungin kung mahirap, tanungin kung mahalaga, right? And I think
Yes.
this career or this episode is mahalaga. 'Di ba? You guys listen to it later and you tell us no kung talagang naging helpful ba tong episode sa inyo later on. In today's episode, we're featuring the career of a human rights worker or maybe a human rights lawyer. No, what would you know? What are the professions that surround this spectrum of a career like human rights? What does it take to be one? 'Di ba? Why is it important in the local setting? 'Di ba yung protection of our human rights? Bakit importante na may mga tao tayo dito? Mga ka-offbeat, unahan ko na kayo to say that this episode isn't for the close-minded. Right? Marami sa atin that whenever we talk about human rights, probably stigmatized na agad yan. Probably iniiwasan natin yan intentionally because laging heavy yung topic. Laging, paminsan dark yung topic, di ba? Especially from the last presidential era of PRRD, di ba? Ang daming nangyaring human rights cases, right? But I don't think that we're doing our work as a media or as a podcast if we don't talk about these careers more, these important careers that are prevalent in our society today.
Agreed. And because it's such a mahirap talaga yung topic, 'di ba? Kailangan natin ng guest na may galing, matalino, and of course, veteran rin. So, our guest today has in-depth experience in the human rights sector, having worked in the Commission of Human Rights for 3 years and as a fellow in the Center of International Law for 1 year. She brings with her a perspective from both the local and global scene. She has also taught political science and legal ethics as a senior lecturer in both UP and Ateneo de Manila University, inspiring so many students to, of course, consider the career to protect our human rights.
I think, Matt, without further ado, I'd like to bring in our guest today, Attorney Ross Tugade. She joins us today in the Project Offbeat podcast to talk about the career of being a human rights worker slash lawyer. Welcome to the show, Attorney Ross. Good morning and happy Valentine's to you.
Good morning, Lance and Matt. Happy Valentine's sa lahat, especially to those tuning in no, to the podcast. Ayan,
Okay.
good morning.
Attorney, first of all, I'd like to say, no, nung nire-research ka namin, nakakatuwa lang that ang lalim ng mga, poems na ginagawa mo, ang lalim ng mga spills mo sa mga Instagram posts. I think you yourself is a prevalent and a great writer. Correct me if I'm wrong, Attorney. I just hope that in today's episode, ilemanize mo naman para sa amin, Attorney, para mas maintindihan namin lahat yung career na to.
Actually, that's the most, I guess, the one of the primary challenges of being a human rights worker, no, especially in the
Yes.
Philippines. You have to distill and communicate something as complex as,
Sobra.
let's say, the international human rights law regime. Paano mo i-communicate yun sa mga estudyante? Paano mo yun i-communicate sa pangkaraniwang tao? Paano mo i-communicate lalo na sa mga biktima ng paglabag ng karapatang pantao, di ba? When
Tama.
you talk to victims especially, how do you assure them?
Yes.
Okay? How do you tell them that you have rights that exist
Yeah.
in law, and these are rights that are worth fighting for. So uh siguro at this point, no, I'd like to assure you that I won't talk about very highfalutin or convoluted topics. So
Thank
let's
you.
bring it down to the ground, because as
Thank you,
you
attorney.
mentioned in your intro, no, this is a very important topic that we must talk about.
Tama. Attorney, you know what? Maybe we can start with the concept of human rights, 'di ba? Ano nga ba talaga ang human rights, no? Because I think when we talk about human rights now, agad siguro na-associate natin to as something that Duterte is violating, or maybe something that Attorney Chel Jokno is always preaching, no? Pero in that aspect of human rights, ano ba talaga to, and anong importance nito sa isang Pilipino or sa isang citizen ng isang country?
Okay, human rights, hindi lang siya feel good concepts, no, na I have the
Tama.
right to life, I have the right to freedom of speech, ganyan. Of course, those things are true. Those things are very real. But when we talk about human rights as something that's immediately important to our day-to-day lives, these are not just moral concepts, but these are legal entitlements, no? Legal entitlement in
Hmm,
the sense na kapag inaresto ka ng walang warrant, for instance, you already have a right and a relief under the law. Hindi lang siya confined, of course, to violations, no? Because when we think about human rights, and this is a problem I actually pointed out to my students last semester when I was teaching the course of human rights sa Ateneo, no? I told them, our concept of human rights is always couched in the notion of violations. May paglabag ng karapatang pantao.
totoo yan. Yeah,
Um, Tinatanggalan ako ng karapatang magsalita, tinatanggalan ako ng karapatan na, ah, magsabi ng kung anong gusto ko. But human rights are also in a sense, aspirational sa isang banda when it comes to, the progressive fulfillment of certain rights like right to education, right to health, ganyan, mga right to food. So yun yung mga rights that we don't immediately think of when we think of human rights. Kasi naiisip natin agad,
yeah,
violations.
yeah,
Pero marami pa, right to education, right to health, right to food, right to housing, right to an adequate living wage. These are also human rights in the equal sense as the right to life, right to liberty, right to
yeah,
property, right to religion even.
yeah. Siguro kaya, attorney, medyo madilim yung tingin ng mga tao 'pag usapang human rights, 'no? Parang agad nilang, "Ay, ayoko 'yan." Parang, "Ay, hindi naman ako ano diyan, hindi naman ako masyadong affected diyan," 'di ba? Kaya siguro puro maganda yung sinabi niyo, it's actually your entitlement, 'di ba? It's not just a violation per se, 'di ba? Attorney, bakit tingin niyo yung mga violation lang lagi yung mga na-highlight sa media? No? Or is there something that we can do there para mas makita rin nila yung other spectrum like you mentioned, 'di ba? A rights to education, 'di ba? A rights to freedom of speech, 'di ba?
I guess it comes with our historical experience, no? Na we've had 20 years more or less under the authoritarian regime in the 70s to 80s, no? Ferdinand Marcos Sr. And then we had the war on drugs under Rodrigo Duterte.
Yeah.
And so our historical experience with human rights, mabigat talaga. Mabigat yung kasaysayan na dinadala natin bilang isang bansa, bilang isang community, when it comes to human rights. So, masalimuot yung or very complex yung relationship natin historically as a nation when it comes to human rights. That's why I guess, and also in the discourse, in the general discourse of human rights, naha-highlight yung violations, and rightly so, I think, rightly so, na ma-highlight din naman yung different types of violations of human rights so that we know what we have to assert and what we have to fight for. But then again, it's a broader world out there when it comes to human rights. You can be an advocate for let's say better standards of better conditions in work in your workplace, and you can be a labor rights advocate in that sense, no? you can be an advocate for mental health, and you will be an advocate for the right to health when it comes
Mm.
to that. So, maraming paraan how to be a human rights advocate. Maraming causes out there that one can identify with, no, especially if your lived experience speaks to it. So that's how we create human rights advocates, actually, to um I guess encourage them to pull out or humugot mula sa personal
Mm.
experience or sa karanasan nila, no, in their everyday lives.
Oo. And I guess attorney, no, everyone can technically be a human rights activist in that regard. Na kahit sa workplace pa lang, they can already fight for their own human rights, 'di ba? What would you say is the most siguro yung most underappreciated or parang not as seen na human right uh, for the typical kind of corporate professional na baka hindi nila namalaya na, oh, actually, I should care about this human right, no? What would you say that is?
Siguro personally as a mental health advocate also, no,
Mm.
I've done mental health advocacy in the past. This is something we tend to ignore, na we just charge it to burnout.
Ay, true.
Ano lang yan, pagod lang siguro yan. But we are not noticing the fact that there's an effect on our mental health. And even, for example, a lot of HMOs don't cover mental health treatment, right?
Totoo yan.
And
Totoo
it's
yan.
Right,
something
right.
that we have to point out na bakit ganon. Walang coverage for mental health treatment and mental health facilities in our HMOs if you're a corporate worker, 'di ba? It I guess working in a high stress environment creates conditions that are sometimes detrimental to our mental health, and it's something that we don't easily notice. So I guess yon, to answer Matt's question, it's with respect to not just mental health but health in general.
Yeah,
Because if you
health
look
in
at the
general.
definition of health in international instruments, for example, it's not just the absence of infirmity or disease. It's the whole well-being of a person, physical,
Mm.
mental, social.
Yeah. Kapag ganun, attorney, in attachment to Matt's question, no? Meron ka bang mga maybe 1 to 2 human rights na meron ang tao na hindi lang natin masyadong alam, but usually it's, often abused, hindi man lang natin alam kailan natin to pwedeng gamitin. Because I remember, nanonood ako ng TikTok. Attorney Chell is always doing this series where, alam nyo ba? Gumagana siya, no? Alam nyo ba na binabiolate ang human rights kapag ganyan-ganyan, di ba? So, attorney, sa paningin mo, anong mga 1 to 2 human rights na kailangan marinig ng mga audience natin na meron sila na pwede nilang i-exercise, no, in case that it gets violated?
I guess not in the sense that they're obscure, but in the sense na sobrang pangkaraniwan kasi na we
Yeah.
take it for granted. I guess first yung due process rights, no?
Due
For
process
example,
rights.
due
Okay.
process rights, no? Ito
Mm.
yung kailangan dumaan sa proseso, no? So we have two notions, yung substantive due process and procedural due process. I won't go into the technicality of it, pero
Yeah.
for example, let's say, again, let's put it in the context of the workplace, no? It's because your audience are corporate workers, no? So let's contextualize it in that setting. So for example, pinatawag ka ng sinabi meron kang violation sa workplace, no? Pinatawag ka ng HR. Hindi ka puwedeng sesantehin or hindi ka puwedeng i-lay off, hindi ka puwedeng tanggalin from work without, or any disciplinary sanction actually,
Mm.
without proper notice and hearing. So,
Oh,
kailangan
may
Oh,
hearing
may
pala,
hearing
no?
pa yun.
bibigyan
Yeah.
ka ng opportunity to say your piece, no?
Mm.
To tell your side of the story, and that's part of our due process rights, no? Yung napapakinggan ka bago ka patawan ng kahit anumang parusa or bago
Tama.
ka bigyan ng kahit anong sanction, no? So that's an example. Yun yung siguro sa corporate setting. So siguro in the larger context, no? we often take for granted yung freedom of speech. No? We often take
Okay.
it for
Mm.
granted in the sense na we've been so used to the fact that we can say a lot of things on our minds, no? We can
Mm-hmm.
say the things that we want. But when, for example, the ABS-CBN shutdown happened, or when attacks against journalists happen, that's when
Yeah.
we take a step back and say, actually, freedom of the press, freedom of speech has been under attack for a while now in our country.
Yeah.
No, and
Akalain mo yun, di ba? Attorney, sa isang
yeah,
democratic country pa?
supposedly
Under attack?
democratic country.
Exactly, di ba? Maintindihan mo kung nasa China, di ba? I think everything's censored. But in our country, like the Philippines, speech pa sa lahat-lahat ang tinira, di ba?
And the
So,
freedom of the
yeah.
press, no, it comes it's a
Exactly.
related right, no. And
Exactly.
we see journalists, media workers being the subject of let's say not just violent physical attacks, no, like what happened to Percy Lapid, for example.
Yep.
Very
Yep.
recent case, very
Yeah.
recent case.
Right,
But
right.
disinformation, targeted disinfo attacks, targeted trolling, no, sa mga media workers natin. Those are manifestations of how the freedom of speech is under attack in the country. And we just charge it to the fact na gano'n na talaga ngayon, eh. But no, we have to see it at a systematic level, how there are actually structures that encourage these very, I guess, very objectionable, reprehensible attacks against media workers in
Tama.
particular.
Earlier we mentioned di ba, corporate audience yung kinakausap namin. And alam mo kadalasan, attorney, sa corporate workplace, nakakabulag yung efficiency, yung revenue, yung profits, 'di ba? And sometimes to the detriment or para sa, tinatamaan na yung workforce that actually makes it happen, no? And na-connect ko to dun sa isa mong sinulat para sa mga estudyante mo when you said, what does it mean to honor creation over greed? 'Di ba? Parang anong ibig sabihin nito, attorney, no? Especially in our highly capitalistic society, in our highly capitalistic workplace, 'di ba? Paano nating uunahin ang human rights, ang pagkatao or ang creation, 'di ba, over greed?
I guess we go back to the reason why we have institutionalized the notion of human rights, and it's precisely to acknowledge human dignity. No? When I work in
Okay.
the CHR, yan yung motto. Actually, yan yung institutional motto ng CHR. Yun. Dignidad para sa lahat. And I guess it's
Mm.
something that applies to every context when you talk about human rights. Um, Sabi ni the father of Chel Diokno, no, si late Senator Pepe Diokno, he said in one of his more famous essays on human rights, sabi niya, human rights make man human. Yeah,
Wow.
it's the fact that we have human rights is a recognition of the fact that if you're religious, we are created in dignity. But
Mm.
if you don't subscribe to any organized religion, it's still the inherent dignity that's attached to being a person. Yung katauhan mo mismo, that's something that has to be afforded with respect, something that has to be afforded with um honor, and the dignity it deserves. So yung makita mo bilang tao yung kapwa mo tao, and
Mm.
not just
Mm.
reduce the person as a tool towards profit.
Yeah.
That's the first step in I guess thinking in a different way when it comes to respecting human rights in the
Tama.
economic sense, no? In the economic context.
Yeah. Minsan siguro ang hirap, attorney, pag ikaw yung boss. And then minsan nakakainis when the workforce is deemed as redundancy. And redundancy has to be cut off from the workforce para magkakita or magka-profit yung kumpanya. or to save their cash flow or whatever, 'di ba? Parang dun mo nakita that ganun mo ba tingin nyo sa mga taong nagserbisyo para sa inyo for so many years and now you're just cutting them off because their skill set is now a redundant thing, as for the different careers na nasa loob ng kumpanya, no? So, thank you, attorney. Maganda yung sinabi nyo, no? It should start with dignity. Diba? Paano, for example, for anyone listening, attorney, how do you reframe your mindset to prioritize dignity of people?
Yung makita mo lang yung fact na makita mo yung kapwa mo tao na merong sarili pangangailangan, he, she has their own hopes, dreams, aspirations, no? Building those communities of solidarity. Because human rights don't exist in a vacuum. Hindi lang yan
Mm,
individual legal entitlements, no? But human rights always are asserted in the context of community, institutions, no? Social structures.
yeah.
So, mag-uumpisa yan, tignan mo yung kapwa mo tao bilang tao, tignan mo siya bilang tao na nakakaranas ng maraming bagay sa araw-araw niyang pamumuhay. And
Yes.
that's when you start feeling that sense of solidarity with your fellow human
Yes.
being. And you start building communities of care.
Mm. Right. At the end of the day, parang empathy talaga yung kailangan when it
Yes.
comes to
That's actually an
human.
essential characteristic, I guess, if you're a human rights worker. No? You're able to not just resonate, no, but to also essentially empathize with the person whose rights were violated or who's trying to fight for greater inclusion, greater space,
Tama.
no? That's where it begins, no? That sense of empathy for your fellow human being.
I'd argue nga, attorney, na empathy is the essential skill for not only human rights workers, no, but all human beings.
Yes, yes,
Para maging, like, I guess we can treat each other with that dignity nga po.
yes.
Going to, like, the Project Offbeat podcast, we always talk about careers and what it entails, no? So we've now talked about human rights. Now let's talk more about the work that you do, no? Can you kind of explain, like, the different paths there is in pursuing or going into human rights, what kind of jobs it entails?
So I can only speak to my experience as a human rights lawyer, no? But there are
Yeah.
different kinds of works in the human rights space. So as a human rights lawyer, I've done a variety of things. No, you've mentioned that 3 years I was in the Commission on Human Rights. Actually, prior to that, I was with the Human Rights Victims Claims Board. I don't know if you've heard of
Mm.
this
Mm.
government agency. It was a government agency. It doesn't exist now. It's the primary quasi judicial, so it's sort of functioned like a court. It adjudicated the human rights claims under the Marcos regime. So that was my first job out of law school. No,
Wow.
I was a legal officer in the Human Rights Victims Claims Board, assisting in the adjudication of claims. So, tinitignan namin yung evidence. If there's evidence that this person
Ooh.
had
Mm-mm.
his or her rights violated during the Marcos regime, during the martial law era, we would give them reparation. So after that, I shifted
Mhm.
to the CHR after the HRVCB was functus officio or was dissolved by law, no, by function of law. I
Mhm.
went to the CHR where my primary work was analysis, documentation, monitoring of the gross human rights violations that were occurring at the time, which is to say the drug war during the time of President Duterte. No, we did a lot of monitoring activities. We did a lot of training. We did a lot of analysis work. No, and then after that, I left the CHR and then went to human rights litigation. So I
Mm.
represented clients before the Supreme Court during the litigation of the anti-terror law. Um, Also, we had clients who who suffered different types of human rights violations at the hands of state agents. No, Right now, what I do is I'm now in the international space. I work for an international NGO, and what we do is we train local partners to give them access to justice, and to give them the skills to maybe prosecute or uh, have um, have access to accountability mechanisms in their own jurisdictions. So more or less, I've done quite a number of things, no, as a
Oo.
human rights lawyer. So that just, I guess, gives you an idea of what
Mm.
kind of things you can expect if you want to go into this career, no, documentation, monitoring,
Mm.
analysis, adjudication, litigation, the whole spectrum.
Pero parang napansin ko rin na it's not really just legal work. I was expecting to hear a lot more litigation, a lot more legal terms. Pero it's a lot of like training, analyzing, a lot of
Yeah.
like what corporate professionals or analysts do, 'di ba? So parang it's kind of interesting na even if you're a lawyer, even if that's your main role, you can also do kind of
Yeah.
different tasks as well to contribute.
Actually, research and advocacy rin, and
Mm-mm.
communication. That's
Right.
part of
Totoo.
working in the
Totoo.
human rights space, because what sense is working in human rights if you can't communicate the cost, di ba? And
Exactly.
you can convert a larger amount of people, and have them convinced that what you're working on is a cause that's worth fighting for. So yung skills that, for example, important to marketers, important din yan for advocates,
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
no? We convince our clients, no? We convince our audience to
To
shift
care.
perspectives and to
Yeah.
care, essentially,
Shifter.
no?
Yeah.
Especially for advocates of, let's say, LGBTQIA plus rights,
Yeah.
Yeah.
who are their target audience. It's the lobbying in Congress, no, to have, for example, a SOGI equality law.
Right.
Yeah.
Now we
Yeah.
know has been held hostage in the past few days again, no, in
Tama.
Congress. But anyway, a lot of my friends who are LGBTQIA plus rights activists and advocates, they do a lot of communication work, actually,
Yeah.
in doing their advocacy things, no, advocacy stuff.
Attorney, at least based on your career, no, as a human rights lawyer, how do you measure success? No, is it numbers of cases won like any other lawyer, or you know what? If say someone thinks differently after your talk with them, you count that as a win. You count that maybe as a moral win. I don't know. No, how do you measure success?
Depende yan, I guess, what you value as a human rights worker, no? For
Mm,
me
that's a good point.
personally, um I'm an educator, also. So the fact that I can persuade, the fact that I can help shape the thinking of younger people, thinking critically towards human rights, I count that as a success.
Mm.
So iba-iba
At
naman
least,
tayo ng metrics,
yeah,
eh, 'no? Iba-iba tayo
tama.
ng metrics. If you're a litigator, of course, it's the little wins in your cases, no? Be it, for example, being granted a motion in court, or hindi maaresto yung kliyente mo, or mapawalang sala yung kliyente mo. I guess if you're in litigation, those are the wins that you count, no? But for me, as an
Yeah,
educator primarily, and as a human rights worker in general, I count the relationships I build, you know, the people I persuade,
yeah.
and the kind of kumbaga brick by brick na ine-establish mo in the space that you're working in.
I see, I see. Ganda rin, no? At the end of the day, ano yung value mo, di ba? What you see as success, di ba? Kanya-kanya talaga tayo mate, no? And attorney. Attorney,
True.
why is it so difficult? Or maybe, so, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe I'm assuming it. Why is it so difficult to do human rights work or this career specifically in the local setting? Is it any different from, you mentioned earlier, may global perspective ka na rin, working for an NGO right now, 'di ba? Mas mahirap pa talaga sa Pilipinas to do human rights work.
It's difficult anywhere, everywhere. Because
Okay. Okay.
essentially you're up against bad actors, what I would call bad actors, no?
Tama.
Um, who are set on violating human rights or violating it in a very systematic way. No, hindi lang one of violations but in a very systematic way. Human rights are being violated everywhere in the world, no? That's why you have these international NGOs that constantly um put out reports or bring out the discussion of human rights violations happening around the globe, no? Specific to the local setting, I guess it's one is a direct result of what happened in the past regime, which is na demonizing human rights discourse. Pag
Oo
human
nga.
rights worker, kakalaban ka ng Estado, nare-red tag ka pa nga minsan. Diba? And that's a threat, that's a risk to your life. That's a risk to your security, your privacy. It's a threat to your well-being even.
Right.
So that's the difficulty of working in the human rights setting right now, I guess. The particularity of which is the demonized narrative of being a human rights worker. I remember in one SONA, it was said that your concern is human rights, my concern is human lives. There's a
Yes.
dichotomy, as if we should separate the discussion of the two. We shouldn't. Because when you want to protect and enrich human lives, in at some point you will turn to human rights. So,
Totoo
Tama.
yan.
Oo.
'di ba? So hindi mo mapaghihiwalay yung discussion na yon. But it's quite unfortunate that a lot of misinformation about human rights and a lot of negative things have been said about human rights work in the Philippines in the past few years.
Yeah. Parang yung mahirap, attorney, sa attacks against human rights, no? And in your career specifically, you mentioned the word systemic kanina eh. Parang it's a series of moves that subtly parang it eats or parang it affects your way of expressing your human rights. 'Di ba? Parang hindi siya isang rektahang biglang may isang taong, "Oy, bawal na mag-human rights," or, "Oy, tatanggalin ko 'yan sa human rights mo." Dahan-dahan nilang parang parang kumbaga parang pinipigilan, no, yung pag-advance ng human rights career, no. Yung systemic ba na yan, attorney, any specific incidents, no, that led to this systemic move, no? Na baka hindi namin napansin as regular individuals that aren't even looking at human rights masyado in a day-to-day basis.
Ayan, ito I take inspiration from what Maria Ressa said, no, na something like our freedoms, our democracy dies with 1,000 cuts, no? It's not
Oh,
one big
yes.
blow. It's these little things na pinasara mo ang isang media franchise, systemic troll attacks against human rights workers and journalists and development workers in that space, no, working in that space. And then on the institutional side, you put out policies like the drug war. You
Tama.
put out policies of red tagging done by state agents, no? In big platforms. So tandem 'yan, no? You have on the one hand your structural institutional ways of
Justice.
repressing human rights, and on the other hand you have these little things that accumulate. And so you create an environment that's very hostile towards human rights.
Yeah. Yung mga bad actors, ang tatalino rin siguro. Admittedly, the way they do it in 1,000 cuts, parang planadong-planado ever since from the start, 'di ba? Yung attack na
Parang
yan.
it goes back to what you were saying earlier, no, Lance, about how corporations want to be more efficient or want to be more profitable, or parang to their investors, they kind of have to maybe even exploit human rights because they're allowed to do so by the system. Actually, that gives to my next point, no, because it kind of reminds me this basketball question before. Parang they ask basketball players, "Do you hate the player or the game?" And it's the same way that a player will exploit the rules to kind of get the points that he like. Think James Harden or like Luka Doncic or something. They will exploit the rules to get as much points as possible. can you totally blame the corporations for exploiting the rules themselves to in a system that was created for them?
Ang ganda ng example mo, basketball. But, I've actually read an article about that 'no, na,
Oh,
yun nga, the NBA is a different league than, it was say 50 years ago 'no.
oo.
Yeah.
Because of yun nga, a lot of rules have been tweaked to favor, certain types of, playing the game 'no. I guess, that's a good analogy in that sense. I'm not a very sports person. But, when you put it that way, it's actually yes, it's about the rules of the game, no? It's about the ecosystem that surrounds the enforcement of rights that, make it quite difficult and, all the more important for us to go to the cause, ano, and,
Yeah.
join the cause and, fight for
Tama.
human rights.
Next question, attorney. Uh, as a lecturer myself sa Ateneo, talagang naka-ano ako dito, naka-relate ako dito sa letter mo to your students sa Instagram. Kaya kanino ka pa kinukote, no? But attorney, no? So another clause or another sentence that you wrote in your letter to your students, no? Back in May 2022. I too am reflecting how I've dedicated my young life to this country and for this to end. In a perfect world, no one must risk their lives because others are losing theirs. Attorney, I can't help but think parang reflective sentence to, no? When you're looking back at your career, I have to admit, no, yung ginagawa namin ni Matt, we're working in tech companies, is nowhere close to the danger that you're doing in your day-to-day life or in your day-to-day career as a
Yep.
human rights worker, di ba?
Yeah.
Attorney, take us through someone, doing human rights, di ba? Pros and cons. Should they consider going into this career, considering every danger that there is to it, di ba?
So, siguro the immediate con is, it doesn't financially reward you as much as say a corporate
Really?
job, no?
I see.
You'd be fortunate if you find, an organization with a good funding source. Then again, you have to assess the values of that organization, no? And, where the funding comes from. So a lot of, moral considerations din. So yun, it's, not as financially rewarding, I'd imagine, no, compared to, corporate jobs or your more regular, 9 to 5s, no? Um, Another con would be, of course, the risk, no? Na hindi lang risk to your life, but, risk to your privacy, risk to your security. Um, Ako, I have to, constantly do a hygiene check on my digital security, no, every now and then.
Wow.
That's a that's an
Really?
example of, how my life is slightly inconvenienced by the fact that I work in this space. Um, but I guess the psychic rewards, no, outweigh all of those. For me at least. But, of course, I had this, I don't want to, you know, I don't want to give the impression also na I'm doing this because I'm noble and all that, no. But, in a sense, I also had the privilege din kasi to work in this space. I can't deny that. I can't deny the fact that, I've had a privileged life to some extent that would allow me not to pursue a
Hmm.
regular 9 to 5.
Tinira ka na ba ng mga trolls
Yung mga
or
trolls, oo naman.
mga troll? Really?
Sa
Oh
comment
my
section
God.
when I give, when I give, comments on a particular issue, I think it was picked up by a news agency once. Tapos ayun nga,
Okay.
na-red tag na ako sa comment section, hindi ko nalalaman. May nag-point out lang sa'kin, "Tignan mo, 'tong comment section sa news article na 'to." So, yung mga gano'n. But then ayun nga, I like to point out the fact that, some of us have the privilege to work in this space kaya we pursue working in
Yeah.
this, no. Had I been, I guess, in a position where, uh I have to I have to earn for another purpose, no, or, support a family, for example, or, support, other people. uh I guess mapapaisip din ako, no, if, the financial reward and the psychic reward are commensurate, no? Um, ayun, gusto ayokong i-romanticize siya. Ayokong romanticize yung fact na nagtatrabaho ako sa ganitong field, no? But it's a reality that I've been able to do so because of the privilege that the life has afforded me to pursue this as a passion and this as a career.
And was this career in human rights law, was it always the long-term thing? I heard you mentioned earlier that you went straight into this after law school, diba? So parang was there no doubt that you could maybe go into corporate law or maybe even other kinds of litigation? Why was this always the goal? No.
First of all, I guess, pagpasok ko ng law school, I knew that I didn't want to do corporate law or a private litigation. I just knew in my heart of hearts, no?
Oo.
At least tayong tatlo dito. I guess, the formation we had, no, in
Yeah.
undergrad, that was one factor for me. The formation I had during undergrad. I was a student org leader in undergrad. I was very critical and very active and very political during my undergrad years.
Mm-mm.
Um, in many ways, that sort of education, quote unquote, ruined me. uh, in the
Namulat ka.
in the
Namulat ka,
best way
attorney.
possible, no? In the best way possible. It ruined me in the best way possible. Na ang daming nangangailangan, no, out there. Ang daming kailangang i-question in society. And I brought that with me going into law school. And what fortified it for me was the fact that one of my professors in law school, sa UP Law kasi we have this marble wall, no, engraved marble wall in the lobby. It's a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes that says, "The business of a law school is not just to um, to make good lawyers, no? It's to make great lawyers and to teach in the grand manner." Tapos sabi sa amin ng prof namin na yun, was a former dean in the UP College of Law, sabi niya, sloganeering lang yan kung hindi nyo ibabalik sa taong bayan. And that struck a chord with me and that stays with me until now. No? It's all sloganeering if you don't go back and give back to the people whose taxpayers' money funded your legal education. This is not to say, of course, that doing private corporate work or private litigation is something that should be frowned upon. No, I highly respect my peers. I highly admire my peers who do private legal work because the amount of brain power that takes to take someone's problem, make it your own, find the solution to it without feeling so
Oo.
emotionally involved. The kind of maturity and brain power that takes, it takes a lot.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
And that's something I don't see myself doing because sometimes I feel like I don't have the skill set for it. I tried my hand at private litigation a year ago, no? Or 2 years ago, I tried my hand in private litigation alongside my human rights work. It was so difficult. I found it so difficult. And it's something that's really not for me because iba yung skill set ko. But I
Mm-mm.
highly,
Yeah.
highly respect those who do it because, my God, they're so smart. They're so good. And for them, and actually a lot of them I know who, at least my peers from law school, still have their principles intact. And that's something I very, very much admire. No, to have your principles intact and still recognize the good causes in this society and do that kind of work. My God, saludo ako sa kanila.
Grabe. In that examples, no, attorney, you've touched a lot about, getting inspirations from your universities, right? And now you're actually a senior lecturer, no, for both UP and Ateneo. You know, can you tell us, or can you tell our audience, posible bang magturo ng human rights or, political science, no, without being a human rights worker before?
As a subject matter, kaya naman siyang aralin eh.
Okay.
There's that the fact na something you can study. But I think it's you bring a different flavor, you bring something new to the table if you're talking from experience. And that's what I guess that's my added value as a lecturer, because these are things that I've personally worked on. These are issues that I've personally worked on. Which is not to say that those who study it purely academically don't bring anything new. They bring critical perspectives, no? But my humble contribution, I guess, would be my own experience as a human rights worker.
Parang nalalagyan mo kasi ng muka, no? Whenever you're teaching a case, natatandaan ko tuloy yung TV series na How to Get Away with Murder, di ba? Parang ang galing magturo ni Annalise Kitty kasi everyday she's facing, murders after murders, right? So, yeah, thank you, attorney, for that one, no? We're moving on, attorney, to the two of the biggest, I would say, poster events regarding human rights, right? The assassination of Kian de los Santos, 'di ba? And yung anti-terrorism bill, 'di ba? Siguro unahin natin yung kay Kian, attorney. And this might have been the poster boy or the poster event for EJ case, especially in the Duterte era, 'di ba? Can you take us through how this event was inspected or researched upon by human rights workers like yourself, 'di ba? What made this event, parang bakit siya yung sobrang daming naging killings, 'di ba? Pero bakit si Kian, no? Bakit si Kian yung naging highlight ng mga 'to?
Siguro before I begin answering your question, I'd put out a disclaimer that one of Kian's relatives is someone that I was able to talk to on a
Okay.
more or less regular basis, no, during that whole time, no. And minsan nagkukuwento na 'pag birthday ni Kian na, lalo na nung first year of the pandemic, 'no, sabi sa akin nung, relative ni Kian, buti pa po sila nakakapag-manyanita, kami hindi namin ma-celebrate yung birthday ni Kian. So, it's, something close to my heart, 'no, yung case ni Kian de los Santos. Um, and now to answer your question, I guess what's universally resonant in that case is the fact that this is a minor. First of all, he was a minor. Pangalawa, he just
17.
wanted to go to school the
Yeah.
next day and attend class, and he was killed so violently, so brutally, uh, in a wrongful motivation, no? In a very, 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 um, I don't know, morally reprehensible context. So that's struck a chord in the hearts of every Filipino who cared about the drug war and who did not call it a victory. That this could have been your son, this could have been your brother, your younger brother, or your kuya, no? Who just wanted to go to school the next day and sit in his exams and build a future for himself. Pero hindi, natapos ng maaga. 'Di ba sinasabi natin ang kabataan ay pag-asa ng bayan, pero pinapatay yung kabataan nung panahon na yun. Hindi
Yes.
lang si
Mm.
Kian, 'di ba? Si Reynaldo de Guzman, si Carla Arnaiz. These names you must remember, no? And second, yung anti-terror law, um, naging resonant siya kasi kahit ikaw na ordinaryong mamamayan, na kahit hindi ka naman vocal about human rights, no, it could potentially affect you and how you practice your freedom of speech, your freedom to redress to petition for redress, no, against the government. Konting tweet mo lang baka maakusahan kang terorista. Anyone can be labeled as a terrorist, no.
Mm.
So that's why I think naging naging hot button issue din yang anti-terror law, because it potentially affects the quality of life that we have, and the kind of environment where we can practice our rights is severely curtailed or limited because of that law.
Yeah. Attorney, yung pag investigate sa mga cases na to, high profile cases, no? Do you take the route similar to what a journalist do, na parang you go into the field, you mentioned you talk to the relatives of Kian, you talk to first-hand witnesses, or ganun din ba yung steps of a human rights worker to drill down into the truth? Because I cannot help but imagine, kung walang human rights worker or kung walang mga organizations like yourself, baka the truth may have never, you know, shed light, 'di ba? Na hindi namin nalaman na isa lang pala tong police operation mishap na naman, 'di ba? What steps do you take to drill down into those truth, no?
Pinaka-importante diyan yung documentation, what we call documentation, which is getting the narratives, getting the evidence, and then
Grabe.
preserving it in some shape or form. I've mentioned I worked in the Human Rights Victims Claims Board, which adjudicated cases from 1972 to 1986, martial law. And the difficulty there was, would you believe, out of 75,000 claimants, 11,103 ang nabigyan ng reparations, when the number could have been higher. We know from other historical accounts that the human rights victims during martial law was around that number, 75,000. Pero ang nabigyan lang ng reparations, 11,103. Why? It's not for the reason that ganun lang sila kakonti. And 11,000 is not konti, no? But ganun lang kakonti compared to the number that's being projected in historical accounts. But because there was not a systematic way of documenting around that time. So fortunately, for better or worse, no, during the time of the last regime, we made conscious efforts to document each case. Kaya more or less meron tayong
Yeah.
alam na numbers, meron tayong numbers na na tinitignan, no? As high as 30,000. The police say it's 6,000 plus, but documentation efforts from different CSOs would tell you it's around 30,000. And it's all because the tireless efforts of human rights workers to document each and every case. Not just for accountability purposes, not just for counting, no, but for
Yeah.
truth telling. To tell you what happened during that time, at that point in history.
Grabe. Yeah. May
Attorney, I think
digitally ba to? Digitally documented?
Um,
Or
some of
sometimes it's
it,
pen
it's
and paper?
yung
Grabe.
I've done documentation work na kausap ko yung biktima, tapos susulat namin
Grabe.
lahat. Of
Grabe.
course, you take great pains to record each and every detail, no? That's why mahirap siya yung documentation work. So it's usually done by not by lawyers, by your human rights workers talaga in civil society organizations. They do the documentation.
Attorney, I think obviously when it comes to human rights violations and the victims of these violations, it's very it's expected, I would say, and I assume na the role of pro bono work and that you do, and parang the access to justice, to human rights, is very important. Can you speak to that kind of kahit let's say these victims or these families, they don't really have the means to kind of to pay for these expensive cases or to pay for your work even. Parang how important is it that they still have the access to that kind of justice?
No, we have a justice system in this country that's a lot of times inaccessible to
Oo.
Totoo.
the indigent.
Nauuna, nauuna pa si Tulfo, 'di ba? Sa mga ganyang
Exactly. Kaya nga sila tumatakbo sa
kay Tulfo.
kay Tulfo, no, sa mga ganitong klaseng programs because they feel like talo sila sa korte, talo sila sa formal mechanisms for justice, no. That's why we try our best, no, hindi lang kami sa CSOs but also um legal aid clinics and law schools, the Integrated Bar of the Philippines, even the Public Attorney's Office. No, I have some contemporaries in law school who now work in the Public Attorney's Office, and I know they're trying their best to provide the the best legal aid, no, that money can't buy. And also these also friends from different um legal assistance groups, no, like Flag. I also know people from Flag, no, and also NUPL, I think, is also doing this kind of work. So importante to have frontliner legal workers to continuously make sure that kahit hindi financially compensable, no, you still provide the kind of legal work that the best kind of legal work for victims, especially of gross human rights violations.
Thank you, attorney. I think on the last siguro and question namin regarding this two major events, attorney, no. Um CNN actually quoted you in one of their articles. And they actually quoted this matrix that you created, parang summarizing yung mga naging changes doon sa anti-terrorism law, no. I hope I'm using the right word. Tamang provisions, or you broke down the provisions that were changed, 'di ba? Um Attorney, I would honestly say na nung lumabas yung batas na to, I even didn't know how it would affect my day-to-day life. I even didn't know how, will corporate workers be affected here, or para lang to sa mga journalists na nire-red tag lagi, no? So parang honestly, medyo hindi kami masyadong affected, at least from our point of view, 'di ba? Etong provisions ba na to, what was the one provision that worried you the most noong ipinasa tong anti-terrorism law? And how do you think it affects us, even if we're not journalists, human rights workers, and whatnot?
Ako, on the top of my head, no, yung inciting to terrorism. Because ordinary acts of
Mm,
speech, mag-tweet ka, mag-put out ka ng infographic dyan or ng cartoon or
shit.
put out a video that for them looks like you're inciting to terrorism. That's already a crime, no? And
Grabe.
given the very broad definition of terrorism under that law, anything can be construed as terror activities. If you're just speaking about something, um, stating your grievances, no, pwede na ma-construe yan against the government na anti anti-government ka, terrorist yung intention mo. And that could potentially affect anyone.
Yeah. Parang that it's subject to subjectivity.
Ano,
Parang
a
no?
wide, a broad,
I would say,
um,
oh,
a wide or a broad notion of interpreting terrorism. And that was one of our arguments during the Supreme Court cases, no, na it gives you such a wide spectrum of discretion na kahit konting bagay na lang terrorist activity na.
Grabe. Nakakatakot, no? Nakakatakot. I mean, why wasn't this laymanized to us, Matt, 'di ba? Nung na-release tong ano, 'di ba? Or maybe we just didn't really look into it that much, 'di ba? So
oh, I mean,
nakaka-desensitize.
marami rin
Yeah.
namang coverage on this particular law, and I think a lot of people, yung argument nila when regards to this law is, if you have nothing to hide, why are you afraid, diba? Pero at the same time, parang nobody understood the implications na, oh, even if you say something against the government, baka misconstrued na agad yun. So I think the vagueness of the law is a little concerning, especially since we're a little more aware that this administration, or the past administration rather, is capable of human rights violations. Yeah. Attorney Ross, no, we're transitioning now to our what's in it for the audience. So this is for people who kind of want to maybe consider pursuing human rights law or human rights work. You could be talking to a younger Ross Tugade when she was still in law school. Or is there anyone you would suggest that they would follow in the human rights field Of course, Attorney Chel Jokno, Luke Espiritu, Neri Colmenares, anyone else you would suggest to kind of follow to get more insights on, policies and human rights work?
Siguro si Attorney Ted Te, you missed Attorney Ted Te, who's the
Oh, right,
flag
right, right.
chairman
Of course.
for so who's the not the flag chairman but the flag coordinator I think for Metro Manila, no. So ayan si Attorney Ted, one of my idols and I consider a mentor also, no, in the human rights space. Um tawag nito, si Senator De Lima, follow that case. Follow that case for a good
Mm,
insight
mm,
on how it's a good study on hope, I think, no? Senator De Lima. So if you've been
right.
following her Twitter, her
Oo.
her messaging, no, regarding her predicament, her case has always been informed by hope. And that's something I find very inspiring as a human rights worker. She herself became the chair of the Commission on Human Rights several years ago. No,
Right. Oo.
um, she was CHR chair. She was a human rights lawyer through and through, and then now she's the subject of this ongoing case. No, I think it's very instructive to follow the life of Senator De Lima in her case, no. Tingnan natin, and also the younger lawyers that are worth following, si Attorney Chrissy Conti, si Attorney Sol Taule, from the NUPL, no. I think they're both from NUPL, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
Attorney Tony Lavinia, of course, also someone I consider an idol, no, a giant in the human rights field. He does a lot of environmental work as well. So, a lot
Mm.
of lawyers, no, to idolize and to follow in the human rights space.
Gets.
Attorney,
Right.
kapag estudyante naman ako, or hindi naman estudyante, more of aspiring to really learn about this career on how to do it. Ganda na sinabi mo kanina. Simulan mo with a use case or a case study like Senator De Lima's case, no? Meron din bang libro or resources na masasuggest mo talagang mamamulat ka about the human rights life or the human rights career pag sinimulan mo sa mga resources na to?
Ako ang number one, yung mismo nagmulat sa akin, I would give us an example. Number one for me on top of my list yung essay which I mentioned a while, which I referenced a while ago, no? Essay ni Senator Pepe Diokno on human
Mm.
rights. Yung human rights make man human.
Mm,
Let me just quote from that, no. So we'd have a
yeah.
great example. Sabi niya,
Naka
no cause
yeah.
is more worthy than the cause of human rights. Human rights are more than legal concepts. They are the essence of man. They are what make man
Grabe.
human. This is why they are called human rights. Deny them and you deny man's humanity. Yon, human rights make man human. I think that's the title of the essay. It's found in his, I don't know if it's still in print, no, pero I think matagal na siyang hindi yata in print. But if you can find in your local library, in your university library, this book called A Nation for Our Children. It's by Jose Diokno. It's a collection of essays. It's called A
Mm.
Nation for Our Children. I was given a copy of that book. Actually, pinahiram sa akin, tas never nang kinuha sa akin for some reason. I lost touch with the person who lent me that book. I read that as a 12-year-old.
Oh my
Mm.
God.
I read it as a 12-year-old, and then what was happening during that time, yung EDSA DOS pa. So,
Mm.
yung political awakening ko, it was a confluence of a lot of factors, no? And that essay stayed with me. It stayed with me. And it's an assigned reading actually sa classes ko, sa human rights class ko. Because it so eloquently and so simply distills the concept of human rights in those few sentences that I've read to you. Ayun, yun siguro yung number one resource ko, A Nation for Our Children by Jose Diok, no? Of
Grabe.
course, if you have time, no, basahin yung Bill of Rights. Basahin yung Bill of Rights. Ang dami, you'd be
Medyo mahirap
surprised.
yun eh.
You'd
Right.
be surprised kasi hindi mo alam kung anong rights ang meron ka.
Exactly.
Hindi mo
Oo,
alam
tama,
Exactly.
tama.
meron ka na those are the most basic rights that you have at just
Don't,
di ba?
oo.
May free time ka lang. Okay, meron sa Article 3 ng Constitution. Mabasa nga.
Oh my God.
No? What's lacking in our basic education
Yeah.
system is this appreciation of our basic rights. So
Oo.
Minsan
um
nga, minsan nga attorney, sabi ko kay Matt, sana pwede natin tanong si Attorney Ross kung may parang cheat sheet na or parang, alam mo yun, na something much more laymanized. Kunwari sabi ko nga before, download ko na lang kaya tong TikTok video ni Attorney Chell. In the case na mahuli ako, di ba?
oh, and
Mag ganon, handbook or,
I'm
yeah,
very much in awe of these content creators na who take pains talaga to
exactly.
educate other people na hindi nagse-spread ng disinformation.
Mm.
Yeah,
Very helpful. So, yung ginagawa ni Attorney Shell, maganda yun, actually. Follow niya sa
yeah,
Twitter yung mga nabanggit kong lawyers, no? Wow, okay
correct.
sila eh. Marami sila
Yeah,
from, yan sila Attorney Neri, yan
yeah,
sila Attorney Chell, marami silang mga thoughts, no, on Twitter na magandang tignan. Insights on human rights practice and human rights in general in the Philippines.
yeah. Okay. Thank you, Attorney, no? Any misconceptions, no? Na papasok sa career na to, ang dami na nating na break today, no? Na alam nila lagi yung dark side, pero nakita rin yung psychic side to it, 'di ba? Which is what you mentioned earlier. Pagpapasok ba na to, ano ang payo mo, no? Or anong iingatan nila na misconception, no? Or myths going to this career?
Siguro yung hindi ko alam kung misconception siya, no? Pero I think you have to also take care of yourself when you're in this field. Hindi lang siya about giving and giving without taking care of yourself or at the expense of your own well-being. Aalagaan mo rin sarili mo.
Ooh.
May favorite metaphor for this that someone pointed out before. I forgot who sino nag-point out sa akin. Pero in one mental health talk that I've spoken and attended in a panel, sabi niya, para lang yan sa pag-emergency situation sa aeroplano. You put on your oxygen mask first before putting it on sa hawak-hawak mong bata, di ba?
Tama.
So you take care of yourself first bago ka bago mo i-attempt na, i-attempt tong gargantuan task of doing human rights work. It's important to know your personal boundaries. It's important to know what you're willing. It's important to take stock of what you're willing to give and what you're willing to compromise. No, compromise not in the shady sense. No, compromise in terms of in the sense na okay, I will give this much time to my work. But as with any other line of work, no, don't allow it to take over your life and
Yeah.
at the expense of, because again, health, no, part ng health yung mental health.
Oo, mental health, yeah.
Yeah.
And secure yourself first, no,
Yeah.
before attempting
Yeah.
to do the hard work.
To that point, attorney, may tips ka ba? Kasi I remembered Rappler journalist Pat Evangelista, nag-speak yan sa amin before, no? And grabe yung mga tinitake niya, mga talagang professor stories, no? Talagang abuse and, di ba, mga murders and all. And na-mention niya how it actually affected her disposition, no? As in, when you look at her aura, talagang kakalibutan ka kasi it seems like she's so parang ang dami niya nang na-take on, no, emotionally, 'di ba?
Yeah.
Attorney, I'm sure you yourself handling human rights, 'di ba? The deaths, and the rights of people. Ang dami mo na ring na-take on. May tip ka ba on how to sort of preserve yourself like you mentioned earlier, 'di ba? Is it a mindset thing? Is it a habit na may ginagawa ka araw-araw just to keep yourself sane from all of these stories?
Important yung yung what I would call a community uh, that surrounds you, no? Yung,
Community.
I don't know if you know Father David from Ateneo Philo.
Oh, I
Uh,
do.
Of course.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Sabi niya sa amin, I will always remember what he said, no? Find kinship among people who share the same values, no? It's important to build those communities. Find your kindred spirits, no? So it's important to keep friends within the human rights community if you're interested in entering the space, no? Find people who can support you,
Yeah.
find people you can talk to. Ako, naging importante sa akin in the past few years that I had friends who do something similar and we can talk about things and we can debrief and we can bounce off each other, no? Yung pinagdadaanan namin. Of course, if you need it, go to a professional. I've went to a professional.
Grabe, no?
Um,
Grabe.
if of course if you need it, no. And there shouldn't be any stigma to that, of course. Um, have a keep a hobby. Important. Keep a hobby. In any line of work naman to keep you sane. So as not to make your work your life. Diba? Do something
Tama.
out of it.
Okay. Thank you, Attorney. No. Last cue for me, and I think Matt has one more. No. Last cue, Attorney. Minsan, alam mo, pinaka masakit, no, bilang people that are na-mention mo kanina na mulat in our education, 'di ba? And in these episodes, 'di ba? Is the fact that the circles of your friends and families are the ones mismo na nagsasabi na okay yung drug war. Nalinis. Nalinis ang krimen, bumawas ang krimen. And I'm not saying totally, sige, let's just say my point sila or whatever, but obviously, we also know the damages that it costs to human lives mismo, diba? And human rights, diba? To our corporate audience na nakikinig that may have the same circles as us, no? And maybe families and friends, diba? How do you tip us into tackling this with our loved ones? Medyo mas sensitive eh, 'di ba? Kasi
Yeah.
iba yung pananaw nila at iba yung pananaw natin. Meron ka bang tips no on how to bring it up in the dinner table, or somewhere else?
Maybe not in the dinner table, though. It's quite a heavy topic and
Yeah,
quite graphic, no? If you bring it
correct.
to the dinner table. But if it comes up in conversations, I guess ask them, what about the lives of those left behind? Because when you take a life, it's not just that life, no, is that life is extinguished and it's done. Studies have shown that the consequences of the drug war are borne by the family left behind. Yung mga nanay na naiwang maging breadwinner, yung mga anak ng mga pinatay in the drug war. Imagine them going to school every day na tatay mo pinatay sa drug war, no? That stigma that will surround them for the rest of their lives. It will affect generations to come. And that point in itself, no, its effect on generations to come. And you ask yourself the question, was it worth it? Was it worth it, no? Naramdaman nyo ba na nalinis yung even the big fish in the drug trade? Parang hindi naman. So, you ease into asking those difficult questions. Was the problem really solved? Number one. And number two, what about those left behind? And again, tap into that notion of shared humanity. Yung tao
Mm-mm.
yung mga pinatay eh. Tao sila. Ayun, it's a difficult conversation.
Yeah. Kahit ano
Sometimes
pang ginawa nila, 'di ba? Kahit anong ginawa
sometimes
pa.
ano, eh, it's also something I want to avoid with my own relatives. Pero
Yeah.
it's
Hirap
also
eh. Ang hirap, honestly. Right?
you have
When
to
you
have
when you tell them talaga bang na-solve, sabihin na, oh, 'di ba? I mean, they can just throw out blanket statements. Oh, nakita mo ba luminis yung okay, yun lang ba yun, 'di ba? Parang and you can't just tell them, can you do more research, right? Of course they won't do that. They won't even bother, you know, taking time out of their daily lives, 'di ba? So, thank you, attorney. No? I think we can start with those questions no para sa mga circles natin.
And I think this goes beyond like government like violations, let's say. There's also like corporate violations. Like for example, there was this one company that basically had a rift with either the farmers or the employees. And when the employees stage a protest, parang nagkagulo. Some even, if I remember correctly, some of them even passed away during the ensuing chaos. Parang and there was a call for boycott, no, in our circles. I'm sure that Lance, you saw it also. But obviously, is this something that is ideal, parang idealistic ba to, or is it something that we should abide by, na we should boycott it? Kind of one of the examples that I was thinking of is, di ba yung Apple, they have like sweatshops or in
Yeah,
China,
yeah,
pero people
yeah.
still use Apple products, di ba? So parang in
Yeah.
the same
Even
vein, parang can we really
Zara, high
avoid,
fashion, 'di ba?
ayun, di
High
ba?
fashion, bad workplace environment. Even I think Zagu just recently human rights
Hala,
violations din no. Some
Zagu,
yeah,
yung
I
parang
heard
milk
no.
tea.
Ba ingat tayo baka misinformation ako. No? I'll look into it later. So go ahead, attorney, sorry.
Ayun, so parang I guess the question I'm asking is it idealistic to kind of boycott and avoid these companies, or is it kind of like our ethical obligation to do so?
alam mo yun lagi nag-aaway mga tao sa Twitter dahil diyan 'no. This
Yun nga
idea
eh,
of,
yeah.
boycotting
Totoo 'yan.
some people are saying, only boycott the company if the workers call for the boycott. Some are
Mm.
saying naman na, you boycott them as simple as that, no? And also the issue of whether is there ethical consumption under capitalism. Diba? These are
Yeah.
very complicated things, but I don't have a straightforward answer to it, but the number one,
Gets.
I guess, most basic thing that we owe it to them is to know what
Mm.
conditions for they're undergoing. No, what are the things that fuel this economy, this hyper capitalistic economy that we have? What are the conditions of work that underlie the the economy that allows us to consume things? So it starts with being informed. Starts with knowing the what are the plight of the workers, no? What can we do? How can we help? So more than anything else, you keep yourself informed.
Yeah. Okay. Attorney, that's all there is to it for our episode. Thank you so much. We actually took up 80 minutes, but it didn't feel like it. I feel like attorney is just warming up, no? Parang surface level pa lang yung mga sinagot niya, Matt, no? So, napakaswerte ng mga magiging students, mga attorney.
Na
Ang
laymanist
daming,
naman, di ba?
na-laymanized talaga, di ba?
Oo.
So, you know, for the students of attorney, no, pagbutihin nyo, sayang opportunity, di ba? Yeah, but thank you for taking us off the beaten path, Attorney Ross. Siguro, can you tell us where you are right now? Anything you want to plug, no, or invite people to do while listening to this episode?
So mga estudyante ko mag-aral kayo na mabuti.
Mukhang
um,
mahirap yung exam ni attorney ngayon, ha?
hindi naman. Nothing to plug. Nothing to promote. Siguro, let's just be, reminder na be vigilant about human rights issues, and let's look out for one another.
Thank you, attorney. Attorney, in case they want to contact you, no, if they want to know more about this career, your career specifically, or you yourself, diba, how can they do so?
I'm just on Twitter, so I'm a tweet away. It's at Rosell. It's at
Yun.
Rosselle. That's the easiest way to get in touch with me, I think.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you, attorney. Um, I think that's it. Thank you, everyone, for listening to our show. If you liked our show with attorney Ross Tugade, hit us up in Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube at The Project Offbeat. Thank you, guys, and kita kits sa next episode.